Joshua chapter 1 at verse 9, the Lord says, "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." I think that verse reminds us of the fact that living for God, seeking to do God's will, requires boldness, it requires strength, and of course, it requires courage to take a step of faith and to live for God. It's a reminder of the fact, as we've been going through the book of Joshua, that really since the beginning of time, there has been a roaring lion seeking to devour and to destroy those who worship and serve God. And while we often think of the lion prowling, maybe in a sense of prowling around in the dark, I think the attacks of the lion are also on full display every day, even in places where we have never imagined, even in places of worship like this. I felt it necessary really this morning because of the time that we are here and really the events of the day and the change to kind of go away from my series in the book of Joshua and to just address the topic, maybe the elephant in the room, you might say. It's not a pleasant topic to think about, to prepare, or preach, or even for you to listen, but it is clearly an important topic. It's something that we need to address, and I am talking about the matter of security. This is something that I approach really with a great deal of apprehension for many reasons. At the very top of my list is our children. I would say all of us as adults have never really, as children, thought or considered anything like what we have to today when we are children. And I know all of us as adults, our children are so important to us here at this congregation. And the love and the joy that they show us. I would hate to imagine that this would be a place where they couldn't have that joy and excitement to be around one another and to worship God. However, we've reached a point in our society where it's crucial for us, I think, to take steps to just ensure the safety of our congregation. And we think about church as it should be, a safe haven. This is a place where we gather every week. We gather throughout the week to study God's Word. It's a safe haven where we come to worship God, but the sad reality is that we're not immune to the dangers of the world. In fact, churches have become places where at times maybe we have to be on high alert. And so I say that to just say we have to acknowledge the situation. But as Christians, we are commanded to love our neighbor. And in order to love our neighbor, we have to create an environment where we welcome all who come to seek salvation, all who come to want to have a relationship with God. We want to invite them in to come and see Jesus. And so in order to do that, I think it's important that we make sure that this is an environment where they can come and hear about Jesus. But beyond these really steps, I think also we have to consider that we approach this topic with a great deal of prayer and faith in God. And I'm reminded of the verse in Joshua 1 of verse 9, our theme verse for the year. And, and also, when I say I approach this with some apprehension, I also just, I don't want to be misunderstood. I switched gears pretty late in the week, and so I have spoken to some who I am comfortable bouncing a lot of different ideas and thoughts off of, but I have not been able to spend the time that I would like to have to present a lesson like this. And so I ask that you just show me love, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, that love believes all things. And I hope you know, and you love me, that you will believe that my motives, my heart for God, for you, and for others is motivated by love. If I were to ask every member of this church, what are your thoughts on this subject? Well, I'm confident that we would all have various opinions and thoughts about maybe what we should and shouldn't do as Christians. But I will tell you, the last few days has reminded me of a really important principle. It is a simple principle, but it's something that we need to be reminded of really often, of the fact that when it comes to any subject, when it comes to life, the question is, what does the Bible say, right? That's how we should approach every subject. What does the Lord say about any subject? And I have found that there are really a lot of verses that deal with the idea of safety and protection and even self-defense. And oftentimes when you think about self-defense, if you turn your Bible to Matthew chapter 5, there's a verse that comes up in Matthew chapter 5 where Jesus talks about turning the other cheek. In Matthew chapter 5 at verse 38, Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, well, he says, turn to them the other cheek also." And so we might read that verse and based upon what Jesus says and wonder, should we allow ourselves to just be harmed and not defend ourselves? Well, first of all, we have to remember that Jesus is referring back to a very specific Old Testament command that's found in the book of Leviticus and Exodus that deals with the law of retaliation. And so in this verse, really God is intending to eliminate, or to limit the retaliation that's involved in these acts. This verse has the idea of the slap on the face. I think could be referring to an insult, but a slap on the face is certainly not a life-threatening injury. Instead, this is responding to retaliation. And what Christ is teaching and really urging us here is to have this selfless attitude by turning the other cheek and going the extra mile. The Apostle Paul would even say this in Romans chapter 12, verse 17, "Do not repay anyone evil for evil, and do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult," as Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 3 at verse 9. So I say that to say these verses really aren't speaking about self-defense. What they're speaking about is retaliation. These verses are talking about retaliating against someone who has wronged us. So the Bible clearly speaks against that type of retaliation. But what about self-defense? I was amazed by this. When you go to the Old Testament, you start looking at various examples. I thought this was interesting in the book of Esther. You recall in the book of Esther, it's such a unique book. It's an amazing story. And one of the things that amazes us is the fact that in this book, the name of God is not mentioned, right? But in this book, the tremendous story about God working through his people to preserve Israel, to preserve the Jews so that the Messiah could come, that the seed of woman could come. And it's in Esther chapter 8. I'd have you turn your Bible there. In Esther chapter 8, I want to show you this, where remember Haman plotted this attack against the Jews. And Esther, in Esther chapter 8, requested to the king that the Jews be able to defend themselves. And so the king wrote a letter, and it says in verse 11, "By these letters the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and protect their lives, to destroy, kill, annihilate all the forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions." So we see here the Jews were allowed to fight against their attackers. They successfully defended themselves, and then they, of course, celebrated that with the celebration of the Purim to mark and to record that event. I even think about in Nehemiah. In Nehemiah, remember the rebuilding of the wall. It was the people there who were building the wall brick by brick. And you imagine that they had one brick in one hand, but Nehemiah chapter 4, I think it's verse 7, it says that they had a sword in the other as they did their work. And they had great opposition as they were trying to do the work of God. So the point that I'm making before we get into some New Testament passages is that we are not supposed to just be doormats. We are not supposed to just lay down and allow people to do whatever it is that they want to do to us to harm us or our families. Now, of course, in the New Testament, the emphasis in Ephesians chapter 6, where Paul tells us to put on the armor of God, that armor is spiritual. That is a spiritual battle, a spiritual fight to protect ourselves against Satan's attacks. But I want you to think about some places in Scripture as well when we think about persecution. Because Jesus has some things to say about persecution. He has some things to say about really the reward of being persecuted for his name. In the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5, the very last Beatitude in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 10, Jesus would say, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." He says, "Blessed are you when people insult you or persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." So enduring suffering for your faith in Jesus Christ has an eternal reward. And that reminds me of what Acts chapter 5 verses 40 and 41 says, that when the apostles were beaten for preaching Jesus, well, they rejoiced over that they were counted worthy to suffer for his name. I think they understood the reward that they were going to receive for that. And so we see those disciples rejoicing over that. However, in Acts chapter 8, I want to show you something. In Acts chapter 8, we see an instance in Acts chapter 8 where the church is being persecuted. And it was Saul of Tarsus who was involved in that persecution. He's wreaking havoc on the church. In verse 3, he's entering house to house. He's dragging men and women off, committing them to prison. And it says in verse 4 of Acts chapter 8, "Therefore, those who were scattered went everywhere preaching the word." Now, would we say, well, they scattered? Oh, they're fearful. They shouldn't be afraid. But here we see Luke tell us that they were being persecuted and they scattered. And I want you to remember what it says they did. They were scattered, but they went about preaching the word. So keep that in mind. And I want you to go back to Matthew chapter 10. Matthew chapter 10. And as you turn to Matthew chapter 10, I want to remind you of what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 28. We won't read that, but in Matthew chapter 28, we read of the Great Commission to go into all the world and preach the gospel and to make disciples. And it made me go back to Matthew chapter 10 of what we often call the limited commission, where Jesus commissions his apostles to go out and to preach, and he gives them instructions for that when he sends out the 12. I want you to notice what he says in Matthew chapter 10. He says in verse 5, "Do not go into the way of the Gentiles, and do not enter a city of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And as you go, preach, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand." Now, drop down. He's sending them out to preach. Drop down to verse 16. In verse 16, Jesus says, "Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Therefore, be wise as serpents and harmless as doves." Could there be two more opposite animals? Could there be two more opposite animals there? A serpent and a dove? Why does Jesus say this? Why does Jesus say to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves? And before that, he's using the metaphor of sheep against the wolf. Why did he say this? Well, the risk of death, it was high. They were entering an environment where they would be seen as prey by predators. People would see these apostles as vulnerable, and they would want to exploit that weakness. And what was that weakness? Well, they saw it as a weakness, I should say, and it was their gentleness, their kindness, their love. And what the wolves saw as really a weakness, it was actually a strength. But at first glance, you might read this and think, well, this seems like a contradiction. I mean, if we think about the serpent, biblically speaking, our minds, of course, immediately go back to Genesis chapter 3. We begin to think about, the Satan in the garden there, and we begin to think about how Satan lied. He's deceitful. He's cunning here. And we associate the snake or the serpent with deceit and lying and cunning. But then doves, on the other hand, there's innocence, right? And there's purity. But when we look at the context of these words here, I think we begin to understand and see the meaning of the words of Jesus. When Jesus mentions or he says or commands, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, be wise as serpents. Jesus, of course, is not encouraging them to be deceitful. We know that. He's telling them to be shrewd, to be discerning, to use what God has given you, the intelligence that God has given you, to really navigate the challenges that they will face as they spread the message. There's a passage in Proverbs chapter 14 at verse 15 that says, the simple believes everything, but the prudent gives thought to his steps. In other words, it's better to be wise and cautious than it is to be naive and gullible. When I think about snakes, snakes, I understand, are usually pretty quick to get out of the way. Before they attack, they're quick to get out of the way. They're quick to go under a rock when they're faced with some potential danger. And so snakes aren't typically, I don't believe, first aggressive in that way, not as a first resort. They usually will remove themselves from situations where they're threatened if they were found out in the open. And so I think of snakes as these frightening predators. But God made them. God made them, and he made them wise. And Jesus tells us, he tells his apostles here and for us to be innocent and wise at the same time. This innocence, I think about a childlike gentleness and love, really in the love of Christ and what he offers us. But then in the same breath, he exhorts us to be wise. And that's something that I think develops in our maturity with Christ. And so we have to be ready for a dangerous reaction. I think that's what Jesus is telling his disciples here. Don't get jaded, but don't let the gentleness blind them to the real dangers around them. And when we get into the book of Acts, we see the apostles, we see the first century church facing danger. And I want you to notice a few reactions. Go back to the book of Acts. We were in Acts 8. In Acts chapter 9, I want to show you this. In Acts chapter 9, a few passages, and then I just want to really just wrap this up with one point that I think we see from this lesson and what it means for us. In Acts chapter 9, it would mention Saul of Tarsus persecuting the church. He's on his way to Damascus to persecute Christians, and there he sees the risen Lord, and he goes in, and Ananias tells him what he needs to do in order to be saved, and he obeys the gospel. And the Lord tells him what his mission is in verse 15. Go, for he is he tells Ananias, go, for he is a chosen vessel of mine to bear my name before Gentiles, kings, and the children of Israel. For I will show him how many things he must suffer for my name's sake. And so Ananias goes on his way and talks to him. But it says in verse 20, immediately he preached the Christ in the synagogues that he is the Son of God. So here is a man who is transformed. He goes from persecutor of the church to preaching Christ. And everyone's amazed by this. This is quite the transformation, quite the change. And because of that now, Saul of Tarsus is on the radar of the religious leaders. And I want you to notice in verse 23, it says, after many days were passed, the Jews plotted to kill him. But their plot became known to Saul, and they watched the gates day and night to kill him. In verse 25, it says, then the disciples took him by night and let him down through the wall in a large basket. He didn't just walk right out into those who wanted to do him harm. Why? Because he had a mission. He had a purpose. Go to Acts chapter 14. I'll show you one more verse. In Acts chapter 14. In Acts chapter 14, we see Paul and Barnabas, and they're facing great opposition to the preaching of the gospel in Iconium. And it says, in verse 1, they spoke a great multitude, both of the Jews and the Greeks believed. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brethren. And so, verse 3, therefore they stayed there a long time, speaking boldly in the Lord, who was bearing witness to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. But the multitude of the city was divided. Part sided with the Jews and part with the apostles. And when a violent attempt was made by both the Gentiles and Jews with their rulers to abuse and stone them, verse 6 says, they became aware of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and to the surrounding region. Don't miss verse 7. And they were preaching the gospel there. Now, would we say here in this instance that Paul and Barnabas were so fearful they shouldn't have ran? Or is this a case of where they're being wise as serpents? So I think we see that it is certainly advisable and at times necessary. It's necessary to remove ourselves from danger. And there is no simple answer to this. I recognize that. There is no simple, quick answer to this. But here's the principle that I want us to see in these passages. When it comes to Acts chapter 8, they're scattered. When it comes to the Apostle Paul being let down by a basket, or here in Acts chapter 14, where they flee when their lives are on the line. Why did they do that? They did it because it best served the advancement of the gospel. You see, the Apostle Paul, Barnabas, every Christian realized that they were stewards of the gospel. They were stewards of the gospel. And because of that, they had a responsibility to carry out that mission that God had given them, the saving message of Jesus Christ. And it would not be wise for them to put themselves in situations where that would not be advanced. And so I want us to think about that in light of our lives today. I said it's a principle that doesn't make really decisions easy, but I think when we begin to discern and we begin to think about the world in which we live, and we examine passages like this, they made their decisions, I don't think in order to avoid risk, but in an effort to fulfill their duties. And so as we think about what we face as Christians today, in our homes, in our schools, in our offices and businesses, and in our churches, we think about what we face. I think what we need to remember is how can we best advance and serve the gospel? Because that is our mission. That is what we are about here at the Vestavia Church of Christ, of holding up Jesus Christ for the world to see, to show that Jesus is the answer to the evil and the sin and the wickedness that we see in this world. And as Christians here, we are stewards of everything that God has given us. We're stewards of this building that we use to proclaim Jesus and gather together to glorify Him. We should be stewards of our families, of our children, and ultimately stewards of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And we should be found trustworthy with that. But as we make decisions and things might begin to look different, maybe a little bit, and things change as they have today, we need to remember that that does not lead us to say we're no longer preaching Jesus. I hope in instances in the world that we live in, the times that we see and the stories that we hear, that we stay or we continue to be strong and courageous to boldly proclaim Jesus Christ in Him crucified to a lost and dying world. Not the sermon I wanted to preach this morning. I think it's a sermon necessary that we need to hear, to consider that Jesus is our mission. He is our goal, and He offers us a reward if we will live faithfully for Him. You might be here this morning and you need to respond to the gospel of Jesus Christ. We want you to know that this is a safe haven for you to discuss your spiritual needs, your spiritual questions, and we want you to know that it's here. It's here in this group of people where you will find love, you will find the truth about Jesus Christ proclaimed, and that you will find refuge and solace in the God, the living God, the God that we serve and worship today. If we can help you become a Christian this morning, why don't you let us know while we stand and sing.